All right, everybody, we're doing a little pop-up session today, this morning on contingencies. So we're going to stick right to 15 minutes so I can make a quick before the big huddle this morning. So let's talk a little bit about contingencies. So I'm going to try to cover a lot of ground here. In a sales contract, in your typical purchase and sales contract, you're gonna have three what essentially are contingencies. Okay, you're going to have due diligence period. A due diligence period is a essentially a free look period. So buyer and seller go under contract. Of course, all these contingencies are discussed and timed within the purchase and sale contract. And the first one is called due diligence. Once the property is under contract, the buyer has an opportunity to further their research on the property. Okay. So what I always recommend to the buyer is that they get a standard home inspection, they get a radon gas inspection, and they get a WDO inspection, which is a wood destroying organisms inspection, sometimes called termite inspection. But WDO, there's another 5 or 6 different bugs or whatever that can cause some pretty significant damage. So when the termite company comes out or the pest company comes out, they're checking for termites as well as a couple different other bugs too. So that's a WDO inspection. Okay. And then of course, if there's any recommendations that are made from the standard home inspector, like for example, if they might suggest an HVAC inspection, or they might suggest a structural engineer, or they might suggest a let's see, what would be another good example? Yeah, those are probably the 2 big ones. Then I would certainly recommend following their advice on that. Okay, during the due diligence period, or let me back up. Typically within a day or two, or probably 2 or 3 days of the binding agreement date, the earnest money is typically due. So the buyer and the buyer's agent are dropping off the earnest money or wiring it into the market center or wherever it happens to be held according to the contract. The earnest money is fully refundable as long as the buyer leaves the contract in a way that they're contractually able to leave the contract. During the due diligence period now I've seen it as low as 3 or 4 days, but typically prior to this kind of crazy market, you usually saw it more like 10 to 12 days. These are calendar days. They include all federal holidays, all old presidents' birthdays, everything. Okay, weekends too. So what ends up happening is the buyer hopefully can get a home inspection pretty quickly, right? And they put together something called the amendment to address concerns with the property. Now, I always tell my clients, hey, we're not going to cut and copy the summary report of the inspection and expect them to fix it all, right? We're looking primarily for health-related issues and safety-related issues, and there's no guarantee that the seller is going to agree to fix any of this anyway. So you get the inspection report back, you fill out the document, sometimes called the ATAC, the Amendment to Address Concerns with the Property, and that becomes a new phase of negotiation. Okay. At any point during that due diligence period, the buyer can leave the contract without penalty. It doesn't need to be, it's unilateral. It doesn't need to be acknowledged, so to speak, by the seller, and it does not have to be inspection related. So another home could have come on the market that they preferred. They could have changed their mind. It could have been anything. Okay. Now, if the buyer makes a request and the seller doesn't agree to it, and the buyer has an opportunity to decide, hey, knowing the condition of the home now and knowing the terms that I have agreed to pay, or whatever edited terms the seller was agreed to offer, am I comfortable moving forward? If the answer is yes, you continue to move forward. If the answer is no, you can leave the deal. Okay, additional research that I recommend for buyers during the due diligence period is making sure that they're comfortable basically with everything, right? Do you want to live here, right? So have you researched the crime reports? Have you researched the sex offenders list and where the nearest sex offender lives? Is that troubling to you, right? Do you understand the demographics and are you comfortable with that? Right? Do you know where the nearest, landfill is? Like, do you know where the train tracks are? Right? It's anything that you might find to be objectionable. This is your opportunity to do the research and identify that it may be an issue and leave the deal. Okay. Remember, all the days, all the time frames are running simultaneously. So the due diligence period, let's say it's 10 days. The financing contingency and appraisal contingency generally are right around the same time period. Usually I see that most often around 21 days. Remember, it's calendar days, and those time periods are starting right away. So binding agreement day, think of that as day 0. Okay, so let's say you go binding on a Monday, then Tuesday would be day 1, Wednesday would be day 2, etc. And they all go simultaneously. Okay. In a perfect world, you would wrap up any negotiation with the due diligence period, then order the appraisal if there's time. Sometimes if all the time frames are tight, you may not have the ability to do that. Okay. First thing is financing contingency. Generally, you see that around 21 days. That is an opportunity. Let's say you've already gone binding. So now you're sending the complete package to the attorney so they can do the title work. You're sending the complete package to the lender so they can complete their file, right? And more than likely, well, let's back up. In a perfect world, the buyer would have a financing contingency that took them through closing. In a perfect world for a seller, there wouldn't be a financing contingency at all, right? So what I've found is 21 days is kind of middle of the road for the two parties. Okay, it generally will give the buyer enough time to go through underwriting, but it generally will not give the buyer enough time to have a fully underwritten, clear to close file. Now, what I mean by that is there may be, once that file goes through underwriting, the underwriter might say, well, I need an explanation letter for that deposit, and I need an explanation letter for that deposit, and I need to see the most recent pay stub to make sure this person's still employed by the time the loan closes. And I need, let's say, this little debt paid off so the income ratio works out okay, right? Let's say it's a little $200, credit card or something like that, right? So with all that said, assuming that those conditions are
Good morning.
right, then there shouldn't be any issue with moving forward as you would expect to. During that financing contingency, you need to get a denial letter. If the loan's not going to work out, you got to get a denial letter and provide that to the seller. If you do that within the financing contingency period, remember it's calendar days, then you should be able to get your earnest money back without problem. It will take probably close to a week to get the earnest money back logistically, but you should get it back without an issue. The only exceptions to that are as if it's what I would call like self-sabotage. So let's say, for example, like the due diligence period is over, and let's say it was a 10-day due diligence period, and on day 14, I lose my job. Okay, well, if I lose my job, I'm not going to qualify for the loan, so that'll be okay. But if I just change my mind and I don't want to buy the home anymore, and I'm like, well, damn, I don't have any way to get out of this unless my loan doesn't work or the home doesn't appraise, and you go and lease a car to throw off your ratios, right? That is not going to be allowed. You can't do that. Okay. The lender will write a letter that details why the loan is not acceptable. And if that's on there and they go back and research that, they're not going to let you get out of the deal because you self-sabotaged it. Does that make sense? You go and, take a lease out on a car, finance a car, and the payments, let's say $400 or $500 a month, and that throws your ratios off. That doesn't allow you to get out of the deal. Make sense? Well, it may allow you to get out of the deal, but you run the risk of either loss of earnest money or being sued. Okay. Now, simultaneously, you're getting an appraisal. The appraisal is for the benefit of the lender. Okay. I want you to understand this idea. Let's say that you're getting a 5% down or 95% down loan. You're bringing 5%, bank's bringing 95%. Think about all of the risk that you are taking, right? You've got 5% down, you've been saving the money, et cetera, and you drop it into the transaction, and you want to do your research, and you want to make sure the home's in perfect shape, and you want to, make sure the comps are legit and all that stuff. Well, guess what? What is 5 into 95? 19 times the risk is what the bank's taking on. So don't be surprised if the bank's got some questions for you, right? The bank's going to want to know you're going to think they're coming for a urine sample next, okay? And it's legitimate because they're taking 19 times the risk, okay? So if you don't have the money, you don't get to make the choices. If you don't like what the man with the money is asking for, then don't take their money. I know that sounds a little in your face, but that's the way it is. Okay. So let's say the home is under contract for $300,000. Okay. Typically you see around 21 days for the appraisal contingency as well. Okay. So let's say that the property is under contract for $300,000. If the home appraisal comes back at 300 or more, you're fine. And you would just, as a buyer's agent, you would just call the listing agent and say, hey, we're good. You're under no obligation to share the appraisal. You're under no obligation to share the number. As a matter of fact, it's not going to help you at all. If you were to come back and say, hey, home appraised for 315, we're good to closing, that's just going to piss off the other person. So you just call them and say, hey, we're good, no problem. No further paperwork is necessary. Okay. If the appraisal comes in less than 300, let's say it comes in at 290, okay, so you have a potential issue here. That doesn't mean that the home is, quote, worth 290. That means that whoever did the appraisal's opinion of the value, who doesn't want to buy or sell it, says it's worth 290 on that day. Okay. So you want to make sure that you are coaching your client through the fact that, like, this random person who's literally getting paid like $150 to do this appraisal, they're way underpaid and they're not all that excited about doing it, right? Has an opportunity to wreck the whole transaction. So they're not like going out there trying to put wrong numbers on the paper, but they're trying to make it work. They're just they just don't want to get in trouble for putting out a high number and the deal going bad because the home wasn't potentially worth that. Okay. So if the appraisal comes in low, the buyer will go back to the seller, show them the low appraisal, and combine that with a document called the amendment to reduce the sales price. Okay. Amendment to reduce the sales price. So the sales price, the recommendation would be, I want to buy this home now for 290 because the bank says it's worth 290. Okay. They seller agrees to sell the home now for 290 and reduce the price, all parties are obligated to move forward. Okay. If they don't agree to that, let's say they just flat out say, I'm not lowering the price, or even if they lower it to, let's say, like 295, that is essentially a no. And now knowing this, assuming that this all takes place within the time period, right, within the appropriate number of days, remember calendar days, then the buyer can leave the contract without penalty. When I say without penalty, what I mean is you're not going to lose the earnest money, but the money that you might have paid for inspections and that kind of stuff, obviously you can't get that back. Okay, hopefully that should be obvious. Now, assuming that you resolve the appraisal contingency issue, if there is one, then you're moving forward. So now most likely you're probably like 3 or so weeks into the process from binding agreement date, and you might have a week or two left to close. Okay. By now the HOA information has all been collected. The seller's information sheet, buyer's information sheet has been filled out. The lender is getting their file buttoned up. The attorney's already probably issued title insurance, so there's probably no problems there, and you're moving forward to closing. Okay. Quick note on that. Make sure that you get your wiring instructions directly from the attorney. Okay. Directly from the attorney. There's all kinds of scams out there to try to send you fraudulent wiring instructions so that your buyer can wire the money to some entity. Okay. Now, there's two other contingencies, or let me think about this for a second. One other contingency is a wholesale contingency. So a buyer would, they'd still have all the protections we just talked about, right? And they'd go through all the same processes, but they'd have one more overlay contingency, which basically says, if I don't sell this property, then I don't have to buy your house, or I can't buy your house and I would get my earnest money back. Okay. There's also one with a kick out, which is what I just described, yet they're still basically marketing the home. So if they get another offer and they go under contract, this just happened to Ashley Goodrich. There was a buyer under contract. She brings another buyer. They negotiate a backup offer. Once that backup offer is secured and binding, that goes back to the seller and says, hey, seller, we got a backup offer. You have a 3-day what's called kick out. So within these 3 days, it's negotiable, but it's generally around 2 to 3 days. Within these 2 or 3 days, you have an opportunity to either release this contingency and move forward without whatever it is, or leave the contract. And in this particular case, they were not able to move forward without releasing the contingency. They left the deal, and Ashley's deal became primary. This is actually $1 million deal. Okay, so that worked. We just found that out yesterday. That was pretty awesome news. Okay, so due diligence period, generally around 10 days. We're starting to see it creep a little lower. Financing and appraisal, usually around 21 days. Sometimes we're seeing that creep a little bit lower as well. What I always recommend is as you are getting closer and closer to finalizing a contract, I would be reaching out to my inspector and say, hey, we're close. What's your week look like? Right? If I'm working with a new attorney, or an attorney's usually not that much of a problem, but if I'm working with a new lender, say, hey, typically in our market, we see appraisals at 21 days. Is that something you're okay with? Right? I had a lender a long time ago that says, hey, we need 40 days for an appraisal. I'm like, I can't work with you. 40 days is insane. I'm not going to ever win a contract if I have to have 40 days. So I'm not going to work with you, sir. Sorry. You see what I'm saying? So all the numbers that I just said, excuse me, you got to make sure that those are doable with your partners. Okay. All right. I gotta run to one more thing, and I'll see you guys in about 10 minutes. This video is recorded, and I'll upload it a little bit later. There is also another one that I spent about an hour with Jamette and Greta about a week ago, and that goes through a lot more detail on the buyer process. It's in the YouTube channel. Okay. I'll see you guys in like 10 minutes.